So when the Fed is going to count the money supply, it's got to think about what it's doing kind of carefully. You can't just start counting whatever it wants. Specifically, the Fed is looking to count the things that people are going to spend. Now, that may sound a little simplistic, but because people spend money in different ways, it makes the job of the Fed a little bit trickier. So let's take a look at the different ways that people can spend money and see where the Fed puts those types of monies in its columns of counting. When we're talking about counting the money supply, there are two different types of money supplies to pay attention to. One is this thing that we call M1. M1 is the things that you probably think about when you think about money. It's all of the coins, so all of the change that you have. It's all of the currency, which is all of the paper money. It's all of the demand deposits, which are really your checking accounts. And it's traveler's checks, which you probably don't think about because people just don't use traveler's checks very often anymore. These are the things that we think about when we think about money, M1. And in late 2019, the M1 supply of money was about $3.94 trillion. That's a lot of money, but it's not nearly enough to make the economy go round. 3.94 trillion is a lot, that's M1, but the money supply, as we look at it, is actually quite a bit higher than that. The amount of money in the economy in late 2019 was over 19 trillion dollars. That's a lot. That's a lot more than just what's in M1 and the checking and the coins and the cash. There's a lot of other things that are part of the money supply, and that includes all of these things. The most important one, the one you're probably most familiar with, are your savings deposits. Those aren't part of M1. There are other things that we call time deposits, things that places where you put your money that you can't have easy access to. You don't have immediate access to. Things like certificates of deposit or money market accounts or some mutual funds. Now, M2 includes all of M1, but it also includes these other kinds of monies. So what makes these two things different from each other? Why are we worried about what's in M1, or why do we pay attention to what's in M1 with such interest and kind of forget about M2? Well, the answer is one word: liquidity. Liquidity is what distinguishes what's in M1 from what's in M2. When we're talking about liquidity, we're talking about how easy is it to spend something? How easy is it to spend certain things? When we're talking about cash, that's pretty easy to spend. When we're talking about coins, that's pretty easy to spend, even if it's not easy to draw. When you're talking about your checking account, that's pretty easy to spend. These are the most liquid forms of money, and those are the things that are in M1. M1 represents the most liquid forms of money. M2, on the other hand, are things that are just slightly less liquid. And you may say to yourself, wait a minute, what about my savings account? I can get into my savings account really easily. I either just go to the bank or I go online and I make a transaction. I move money from my savings account to my checking account. And that's the difference. It takes time. Even if it's just a little bit of time. It takes time to access these kinds of things that are in M2, that were on that list that we saw. It takes a little bit of time to access these types of money. they're just a little less liquid. So M2 includes all of M1 plus these little bit slightly less liquid forms of money. But they're so easily accessed, even if it just takes a little bit of time. We think about all of this stuff as M2. We think about that as the money supply. It's still pretty easy to access those things. So M2 is really the money supply that the Fed pays the most attention to. It used to be that the Fed would report numbers on M3 and M4, and I think it was up to M9, whatever it was. Things just got progressively less and less and less liquid to the point almost of absurdity. So the Fed said, you know what, forget this, we're just going to focus on M2. Now, if that's all there was for the Fed to do, just to differentiate between M1 and M2, you'd still might think that, boy, the job of the Fed is really, really easy. They're making this look way harder than it has to be. But in reality, of course, that's not the only thing that's part of counting the money supply. There are some other much more difficult things to consider when it comes to setting the money supply and controlling the money supply, or monitoring and managing the money supply. A large part of that has to do with this weird kind of twilighty zone way that our economy, that our monetary system is set up. It's really kind of weird. So let's take a look at how that system is set up, and how the money system itself and the monetary system itself is established, to try to understand a little bit more about what it means to count the money supply. Because again, it can't just be as easy as saying how much is in people's savings account and how much is there in people's checking accounts. And of course, it isn't that easy, because we live in what is called a fractional reserve system. To understand what a fractional reserve system is, it's probably best to understand what a fractional reserve system isn't. We are not a 100% reserve system. This is not what our economy is. This is not how our banking sector is set up. We are not this. What is this? Well, what this is you taking your money to a bank. So this is a bank, and you take your money to the bank and you put your money in the bank. The teller says, hey, thank you so much for putting your money in here. And you say, it's my pleasure. And so the teller takes your money, walks to the back of the bank, spins the wheel, and opens up the vault and puts your money in a little box with your name on it. That's what a 100% reserve system would be. The teller would then close the door, come back to you and say, oh, and by the way, because we are a 100% reserve system here, you need to pay us to hold your money in our safe, in our vault. That's pretty much all it is. If we have a 100% reserve system, then the banks become nothing more than storehouses for money. And they would end up charging you a fee that you would have to pay to the bank so that the bank keeps your money safe. Now, when we talked about the loanable funds system, we know that's not how our banking system works. We know that the bank takes your money, they don't have any problem with that, but then they end up lending it to someone else. Now, the reason they can lend it to somebody else is because our banking system is not a 100% reserve system. Our banking system is what we call a fractional reserve system. And what that means is that the banks don't have to hold all of your money in reserve. It doesn't have to hold all of the money that you deposit in a vault somewhere. Instead, what happens, of course, is that they take some of your money, they lend it out, but they can't lend it all out. A fractional reserve system means that banks must hold a fraction of deposits in reserve, in a vault, in a box somewhere. They have to put it away for safekeeping. Banks must hold a fraction of deposits in reserve. Reserves are the portion of a deposit banks don't lend. And there are two types of reserves. So you have your reserves that a bank must hold. Those are called required reserves. Required reserves are the portion of a deposit a bank can't lend. And currently, that's 10% of a deposit. Now, there is some question about how long this is going to last as the Fed changes some of the rules, but for now, it's 10%. If a bank holds more than 10% in reserve, those are called excess reserves. So this is any amounts above the required amount a bank chooses to hold. In other words, this is the amount of a deposit that is not lent, but could be if the bank wanted to. Those are your excess reserves. So we have these two different kinds of reserves. This is important because when the bank starts to accept deposits, the bank is going to use those deposits to actually create money. All right, let's take a look at how that happens. We're going to use a very rudimentary accounting system here called a T account. A T account is called a T account because it looks like a T. And on one side of the T, we have assets. These are things that are valuable for the bank. And on the other side, we have liabilities. These are things that the bank is responsible for. So let's say that here you are. You're walking around minding your own business, and you look down, and there on the ground is a $100 bill. You look around, you don't see anybody. You say to yourself, this is amazing, this is a great day. Let me take this money and put it away for safekeeping. So you take your money to the bank. And you walk in, you see a teller. The teller says, hey, how's it going? Welcome to our bank. You say, hey, I'm doing great. I'd like to make a deposit, please. So you put your money in your checking account. That becomes a liability for the bank. We're going to refer to that as a demand deposit. Because if you demand that money back, the bank has to give it to you. That becomes a liability for the bank. The bank is required to give you that money back. And if they don't, they got a problem. And you got a problem. But their problem is bigger if they don't give you your money back. On the asset side, however, what we see is that the bank now has some assets. They have what we've been calling reserves. Now the question is, how much in reserve do they have? If this were a 100% reserve system, then the reserves would equal $100. In a T account, the two sides always have to equal each other. So in a 100% reserve system, you put your money in the bank sits around kind of twiddling its thumbs, holding on to your money, but they can't do anything with it. But that's not how the system works. We do not have a 100% reserve system, so let's take that out and take a look at what we do have. Now the two sides have to equal each other. But in a system where we have a 10% required reserve, then 10% of your deposit must stay at the bank in the form of a required reserve. The remaining $90, though, That is now excess reserve. And those excess reserves can be lent out. Now, the bank wants to make a loan. Remember, banks make loans and they charge interest. So the bank wants to make a loan because that allows them to make profits. So here is a basic T account. In this T account, we have $10 in required reserves. We have $90 in excess reserves. And we have $100 in demand deposits. Before we go any further, let's take a look at what's gone on with the money supply. So here in red, I'm going to say, here's our running total of the money supply. You have $100 in cash. So the money supply is $100. You go and you put your money in the bank. You no longer have $100 in cash. Instead, you have $100 in the form of a checking account. So far, the money supply is still $100. It has not changed. It's just changed forms. The job of the Fed is here very easy. But what happens when the bank makes a loan? Well, when the bank makes a loan, things change. Here is the T account. Here are assets. Here are liabilities. Right now, the bank has $10 in required reserves. They have $100 in demand deposits. And they have $90 that they haven't done anything with yet, but now they are going to. They are going to make a $90 loan. Because right after you leave the bank, here comes a guy looking to borrow some money. And the bank says, guess what? We can lend money to you. We will make a $90 loan. How would you like that? He says, give me $90 in cash. And he walks out the door. Well, look at what happens to the money supply as a result of that. The money supply is made up of cash, checks, coins, and all those other things that are part of M2. There is $100 in your checking account. You can still spend that. The bank is required to give it to you if you ask for it. But they just made a loan and gave this guy who walked into the bank $90 in cash, which means that the money supply is now $190 because there is a checking account from which you can draw, and this guy has cash. The money supply is $190. Now let's say that this guy takes his cash, and he takes his cash to another bank. We'll call this Bank 2. Up here is Bank 1. And into Bank 2, he takes his money and makes a deposit. So there is a $90 demand deposit here, made by our man in the top hat. This bank says, thank you, sir, for doing your banking here. He says, it is my pleasure. This bank now has $9 in required reserves. But they have $81 left over in excess reserves. Now let's say that this bank, in the interest of earning a profit, takes that money and makes a loan out of it. So it's no longer excess reserves, it is an $81 loan. Here comes a lady who wants to borrow money to start a business. They make her an $81 loan. She walks out of the bank with $81 in cash. What has happened? Well, by making that loan, we've just turned our $190 in money supply, which was your checking account, which is this guy here, his checking account now, because he's taken the $90 and deposited it, and the second bank has given this woman an $81 loan, and they've given her cash, which now means that our money supply is $271. Even though there is no new money printed. There's no new money printed. The only actual physical currency in this whole process thus far has been the $100 you found laying on the ground. The Fed's job is getting more difficult here, because when banks make loans, they create money. When banks make loans, they create money. And the job of the Fed gets more difficult. So what is the Fed to do here? How is the Fed going to control the money supply if banks keep making loans, perfectly legal loans, and it keeps creating more money? How far could this process possibly go? Well, the answer to that question involves something we call the money multiplier. The money multiplier is actually this mathematical representation of 1 over the reserve ratio. So if our reserve ratio is 10%, what we're going to do is we're going to take 1 and divide it by 0.1. And when we do that, of course, we get the number 10. That 10 is our money multiplier. And what that means is that for every dollar printed, it is possible that we create 10 new dollars. So if you have $100 that you find laying on the ground and you go make a deposit, and then the bank lends that money out as many times as it possibly can, over and over and over and over and over again, and that money gets deposited and then relent and then deposited and relent, and each time 10% keeps getting pulled out of it, it means that we could possibly create $1,000. We take 10, which is our money multiplier, and we multiply it times the original amount of paper currency. In this case, the $100 that you found laying on the ground. Money multiplier times paper equals the potential money creation. So when the Fed says we want to print some money, they've got to be aware of the money multiplier. And of course they are. But it doesn't mean that that's how much money will be created. If nobody borrows, or if banks don't lend, we're not going to get $1,000 created. So somewhere between $100 and $1,000 will be created. How much? That's where the job of the Fed gets really difficult. It's not just a matter of counting paper. It's not just a matter of saying, how many hundreds do we print today? The question is, what's going on with banks and their lending processes? That's why the Fed is so interested in what happens in the banking sector. So the job of the Fed is to control the money supply. Sometimes they find that there's too much money in the economy, and sometimes they find that there's not enough. Sometimes they want to achieve certain objectives by changing that money supply. Maybe they want to fight inflation. Maybe they want to try to stimulate the economy. And so the Fed's got to come up with a plan. It's up to the Federal Open Market Committee to set that plan. And the two things that the Fed can do, and there's really only two, is to try to either expand the money supply or contract the money supply. Whichever choice they make is going to be accomplished by one primary tool. So let's take a look at exactly what the Fed is doing and what tool they use and how they apply that tool. Once we've done that, we'll have a pretty good understanding of what the Fed is trying to do these days as the economy is kind of heading in the wrong direction. When the Fed does what it does, when it's working to control the money supply, it's what we call monetary policy. Monetary policy can only be controlled by the Fed. What the Fed does when it controls the money supply is called monetary policy. Monetary policy, what the Fed is in the news for, is just the Fed doing what the Fed does. It's trying to control the money supply. It's trying to manage the money supply. And there's only two ways that the Fed can go about this. We call them two different types of monetary policy. Either the Fed can be using expansionary monetary policy, which, as the name implies here, means that they're trying to grow the money supply, or they can be using contractionary monetary policy, which means that the Fed is trying to shrink the money supply. Either way, the outcome of what the Fed is doing is on one particular side of the macro economy. The goal of monetary policy is always and only to shift the aggregate demand curve. Going back to that model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we talked a little bit about this, the idea that policy could be used to shift the curve. Well, when we're talking about monetary policy, really the only curve that can be shifted with monetary policy is the aggregate demand curve. Because what's going on when the Fed changes the money supply? It's either allowing people to spend more, which is going to affect consumption, or it's doing something to reduce interest rates, which is going to affect investment. And those are parts of aggregate demand. So in this particular graph, what we're seeing is expansionary monetary policy. In this graph, in this graph, the Fed is trying to increase the money supply to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So whenever we increase the money supply, and I'll just say MS stands for money supply, what you're doing is you're increasing aggregate demand. And if you were to decrease the money supply, in other words, if you were to use contractionary monetary policy, this would decrease aggregate demand. And so in that case, we would see the curve, the aggregate demand curve, shift here to the left. Leftward shift from AD1 to AD3 would result from the Fed reducing the money supply. Now, we'll talk a little bit about why they do these things in just a minute, but let's talk about, first of all, about how they do these things. The Fed has one giant tool that it uses. It's the tool that it has been using now with a great deal of consistency for probably the last 30 years or more. And that is, the Fed uses what's called open market operations. Open market operations involves the buying and selling of bonds. And it also involves something that's been referred to recently as quantitative easing, which is really the buying and selling of bonds on an enormous scale. Now, this idea of open market operations gets back to something that we talked about when we were talking about the parts of the Fed, or the structure of the Fed. If you remember, I said there were three Federal Reserve districts that were important. There was the San Francisco district, which was the largest. There was the Cleveland district, which is where Robert Morris is. And there was the New York Fed, the New York district. And that the president of the New York district of the Fed was kind of like the eighth member of the Federal Reserve Board. And now this is the reason why this is so important. The New York Fed president is the president of the bank that conducts open market operations. Whenever the Fed wants to do open market operations, it does it through the New York Fed. So again, what are they doing here? Well, they're buying or selling bonds. Usually government bonds, but recently they've changed their tune a little bit, and they've started to, at least within the last couple of weeks, they've said that they may start buying and selling bonds of companies. But usually the traditional way of using monetary policy is to buy and sell government bonds. So the Fed has two other tools that it can use, although they're not used very frequently at all. In fact, this first tool that we're going to take a look at hasn't been used really since 1992. The Fed can change the reserve ratio. In other words, it can change how much it requires the banks to hold in reserve. The other tool that the Fed has at its disposal is that it can change the discount rate. This is the rate that the Fed charges banks to borrow if they want to borrow money from the Fed. Remember, the Fed is a lender of last resort. They can change the discount rate. These two tools have not really been used very much at all. I almost want to call them old-fashioned tools, especially in the light of open market operations and quantitative easing. So I'll mention them here, and I'll mention the way they're used, but we're not going to spend much time with either one of those two tools. So if the Fed wants to expand the money supply, what does it do? Well, the first thing that it does most frequently is that it buys bonds. Let's take a look at how the process of buying bonds occurs. Okay, so what happens when the Fed goes out to buy bonds? Well, it sort of works like this. Let's say this is you, just walking along, minding your own business. And in your hand, you are holding a bond. And you like the bond, you like having that, you like the interest that it gives you, but you realize it's pretty hard to spend a bond if you go to the gas station or you go to the grocery store. So you would like to get rid of that bond and exchange it for some cash. Well, it just so happens that as you're walking down the street, you run into somebody who works for the Fed. And in their hand, they have basically a bag of money. And so you're walking down the street, and here comes the person from the Fed, and they see you, you see them, you make eye contact, and the Fed stops you and says, hey, looks like you have a bond there. Would you be interested in selling your bond to me? We are trying to buy bonds right now. And it just so happens that, of course, you are interested in that. So you take your bond and you give it to the person from the Fed. And the Fed gives you the money. Now, there's this transaction that takes place. And when that transaction takes place, the money leaves the hand of the Fed, leaves the bag of money that the Fed has. And when it touches your hand, basically what happens, sort of through magic almost, is that we say money enters circulation. In other words, through this process, the Fed is taking money that it has, stacked up in a warehouse somewhere, useless to anyone. And when it is possessed by you, it can now be spent in the economy. And hopefully you go out and spend that money, you increase your consumption, which changes economic activity. So when the Fed is buying bonds, this is really what they're doing. They're putting money into circulation so that more economic activity can take place. So that's what happens when the Fed buys bonds. By buying bonds, they put money into the economy that can be spent. Now, typically when we buy bonds, when we're talking about buying bonds, the Fed does not go to individuals like you or I and buy bonds directly from us. We don't have enough bonds for that to make a dent. They go to these investment banks. They go to these large financial institutions that have tens or hundreds of millions or maybe even billions of dollars worth of bonds, and they buy on large scale. This is the favored tool of the Fed. The Fed could also lower the reserve ratio because, of course, if banks didn't have to hold as much in reserve, then they could make more loans. And the more loans you make, the more the money supply can increase. So that's one, a second option. But again, the Fed hasn't done that in a long, long time. And the Fed could lower the discount rate. That would make it cheaper for your commercial bank to borrow from the Fed if they needed to. But this isn't a tool that the Fed uses very often either. The primary way that the Fed expands the money supply is through the buying of bonds, and specifically through buying of government bonds. On the other side, the Fed could contract the money supply. By contracting the money supply, or to contract the money supply, the Fed most frequently sells bonds. This works in the reverse of what we saw with buying bonds, but let's take a look at a picture of that. So here's the Fed. Now the Fed is the entity or the party in the transaction here that has the bond. And the Fed sees you, and here you come down the street and you're thinking, oh, I've got this money now, and having the money is fine, but I kind of miss having my bond. So the Fed sees you, you see the Fed, you make eye contact, and you both realize, okay, here we are, but now we're in different positions. We're able to conduct a transaction that should hopefully make us both happy. You want your bond back, and the Fed wants your money. They're selling this bond. And so when the Fed sells you the bond and you buy the bond and give that money to the Fed, well, basically what we're seeing is as soon as that money gets into the hand of the Fed, that money leaves circulation. It's no longer eligible to be spent. So when the Fed sells bonds, it is taking money out of the economy. That's what makes this contractionary monetary policy. The Fed could use its other two tools as well. It's just not very frequent. They could raise the reserve ratio, which would mean, of course, that the banks would have to hold more in required reserves, so they would make fewer loans. Or they could raise the discount rate, which would make it more expensive for a commercial bank to borrow from the Fed. So presumably they would borrow less, which would leave them less money to lend. So contractionary policy in order to conduct contractionary policy, you would use the tools to either sell bonds, raise the reserve ratio, or raise the discount rate. So that leaves us with the last question of monetary policy, and that's why would the Fed want to do either one of these things? Well, the Fed has what's called a dual mandate. The dual mandate says that the Fed is in control of the money supply and you want to control inflation, but you also want to keep an eye on unemployment. And if unemployment is starting to creep up, the Fed has a role to play in trying to push it back down. So if the economy is slowing down, then maybe the Fed needs to use monetary policy to kind of speed it back up, to expand the economy. And so that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And we know if we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, that would result in greater output, and greater output requires more workers. Let's take a real quick look at that in a graph. So when the Fed is conducting expansionary policy, again, it's trying to expand things in the economy. Specifically, it's trying to affect aggregate demand. So here's what that looks like. Remember, we have GDP along the horizontal axis. We have price level along the vertical axis. And here is aggregate demand. Here is short-run aggregate supply. And here is long-run aggregate supply. Typically, what's going on when the Fed is trying to conduct expansionary monetary policy, the economy is in a recession. So GDP is below the natural rate of output. And the Fed is trying to use its monetary policy powers to shift that aggregate demand curve back to the right to get the economy back in equilibrium, at least that long-run equilibrium. So right now, the economy is at B. It's in this short run kind of, oh, no, this is bad. We're below the natural rate of output. And we want to get back to this point A where everything is in equilibrium. Of course, when this happens, if the Fed does its job properly, then it's going to increase GDP, which is good. And of course, this would increase employment, or if you want to think about it as decreasing unemployment, you can do that as well. It's the same thing. So GDP goes up, employment goes up, but we also see the side effect of higher price levels. So there should be at least a little bit of inflation. Now, the Fed is looking at the conditions of GDP and saying, you know what, inflation, sminflation, we can deal with that later. We're not going to worry about that right now. What we want to do is try to increase employment because that's the bigger problem right now. So when the Fed conducts expansionary monetary policy, this is what they're trying to achieve. Now, if the Fed said, whoa, unemployment looks fine, but inflation is getting out of control, prices are rising too quickly, then the Fed could use contractionary policy to try to slow things down. That would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left and put downward pressure on the price level. Here's what that would look like in a graph. Okay, so when the Fed conducts contractionary monetary policy, what it wants to do is to slow the economy down. Here's GDP, here's the price level, here's the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the long-run aggregate supply curve. But the aggregate demand curve currently is right here. And because we're right here, that means GDP is above the natural rate. Employment is really high. There's very few people out of work. But the price level is above what the Fed is comfortable with. So we'll just call this, P with an H beside it for high price level. And the Fed is looking at this and they're saying to themselves, you know what? Inflation is getting out of control. Contractionary monetary policy is almost always aimed at reducing inflation. So inflation is too high and the Fed is getting nervous. So what they want to do is contract the money supply, reduce that money supply to try to pull aggregate demand back so that we are back in our long-run equilibrium. When the Fed does this, when the Fed conducts this contractionary monetary policy, what we should see happen is GDP fall, employment fall, or if you want to think about it the other way, unemployment goes up. And the real goal here is that the Fed is trying to reduce inflation. So this is the main objective of the Fed when they conduct contractionary monetary policy. So the Fed's job is to control the money supply. It uses monetary policy to do that. And sometimes it wants to increase aggregate demand, and sometimes it wants to pull it back. Sadly, right now, we are in a position where the goal of the Fed is to try to increase the aggregate demand. They are pretty much terrified that the economy is going down a road where things are going to get really bad, and they want to try to head that off if they possibly can. So the Fed is using quantitative easing on a massive scale to try to shift aggregate demand to the right. They're trying to stave off any fear. They're trying to send a signal that that monetary policy will be there to stimulate economic activity, and they want to keep unemployment from getting too high. Right now, they're not worried at all about inflation. So the Fed has undertaken some pretty unusual steps. We'll just have to see if they work. Hopefully they do. Hopefully they limit any pain that this pandemic is causing economically. And again, we're going to wait and see. We're sort of in that position right now, but that's one of the reasons why the Fed has done what it's done in terms of quantitative easing, is because it wants to shift aggregate demand to the right to try to stimulate the economy as much as it can. What we're going to take a look at next is whether the Fed might look to another source of policy for help, because the Fed only controls the money supply. When it comes to taxing and spending at the government level, that's a whole different ballgame.